Early on the morning of Friday, August 9th, 1991, in a small town in south-central Arizona, a man stepped out of his home and stood quietly on the doorstep, his face turned to the east where the sun was just starting to show above the horizon. Even though he had gotten up early so he could get some gardening in before the real heat of the day set in, now that he was actually outside, he showed absolutely no sign of hurrying. His unlined face and dark eyes were serene as he watched the first rays of light spreading over the desert that bordered one side of the property where he lived and the cotton fields that bordered the other side. Once the sun was up, the man stood with his eyes closed, still as a statue, for several more minutes, taking in the sounds of the world waking up around him. He could hear the hum of insects, along with birds cooing and scratching in the dirt for seeds. He was also aware of the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the movement of a very slight breeze through the branches of the nearby cottonwood trees he had planted 2 years ago. For 36-year-old Buddhist monk Parush Kanthong, these early morning hours that he could spend alone in his garden were often the most peaceful and reflective part of his day. Now, opening his eyes, Parush turned his attention to the narrow path along the side of the single-story white stucco building with the red roof that he and 5 other monks called home. When Parush had first arrived in Arizona from his native Thailand 8 years ago, he had led a small Buddhist community in the state capital of Phoenix. But back in 1985, after the community had scraped together enough money to buy these 5 acres of rural farmland located 20 miles west of Phoenix, Parush had worked tirelessly to collect the money that allowed them to build this modest temple, which was called Wat Pram Kunaram. Since opening its doors 2 years ago, the temple had become an important site of worship for the 1,300 members of Arizona's scattered Thai Buddhist community. And as the abbot of the temple, an abbot is the leader of a monastery, Parush oversaw not only the services, classes, and festivals that the temple offered its worshippers, but he also oversaw the training and education of the 5 monks and 3 novices and temple helpers who currently lived there. Stepping away from the door he had been standing in that led back into the temple's dining room, kitchen, and simple bedrooms, Parush adjusted his bright saffron orange robe and began walking along the narrow path that ran the length of the temple. He listened to the gentle slap of his sandals as he slowly walked past the eggplant, basil, lemongrass, and mint that he had planted alongside the mango, banana, pomegranate, and loquat trees. Coming to a stop near the end of the path, Parush knelt down in front of one of the many little shrines that dotted the garden. As he knelt, he picked up a handful of dry soil and let it run through his fingers. Back in Thailand, August was the wettest month of the year, when rice farmers could expect 19 inches of rain. And until his move to Arizona at the age of 28, Parush marked his country's rainy season by staying indoors, so there was no chance that he and his fellow monks might accidentally step on and damage any of the rice seedlings growing in the nearby paddies. But out here in the Arizona desert, things were totally different. Water was scarce, and so it was a very precious commodity. If your property met certain minimum size requirements, you could sign up for a weekly water distribution that was delivered to each property through an irrigation system of pipes and gates. While the temple property was too small to qualify for this water allotment, Parush had worked out an agreement with his neighbor Betty Kraft, whose property also failed on its own to meet the minimum size requirements. But together, their 2 properties were big enough to sign up for a weekly water distribution, and so they did that, and Parush and Betty shared the water between them. He grinned as he thought of Betty. She loved gardening as much as he did. He'd see her that night, since Friday was the night that the town posted the weekly water distribution schedule. He knew Betty always worried that he might forget to close the headgate on the temple's property, which prevented their shared water allotment from flowing through to the next property along the irrigation line. And so, on whatever day they were scheduled to get their water, Betty almost always called Parush just to make sure that he had adjusted the headgate and opened his hoses so they wouldn't waste or lose even a single drop of their shared water. That was good though. Parush always enjoyed comparing notes with Betty, and he would find out this evening how her fig trees were doing. Maybe that was something he should add next year to the gardens at the temple. Collecting a handful of basil and lemongrass, Parush felt the air growing hotter, and he knew that soon he would hear the sounds of activity inside the monastery as the monks began their morning routine of meditation and work around the temple grounds. As he enjoyed his last few minutes of solitude, Purusha was again thankful for the temple's remote location. In Thailand, practically the entire population was Buddhist, but in Arizona, the sight of Thai monks in their bright orange robes with their shaved heads was unusual, and it had drawn a lot of public attention and curiosity at the temple in Phoenix. But here, out in Waddell, the temple's location was so far away from the center of town that many of the town's 1,500 residents didn't even know it existed. And those who did, like Betty, they had come to welcome the sight of the monks in their orange robes quietly going about their business. And so, Purusha and the other monks and Thai members of the temple were all basically left alone to meditate and practice their religion. At the core of their religion, Buddhism, is the belief that human life is one of suffering, and the only way to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana, is through meditation, spiritual and physical labor, and good behavior. Buddhists also believe in reincarnation, that you are reborn again and again after death until you reach that final state of enlightenment and you are released from suffering. Buddhist monks play a key role in the religion by living a very simple life that allows them to meditate not only on their own path to enlightenment and acceptance of the present moment, but on enlightenment, peace, and non-violence for all people. By 11 a.m., the temperature outside had reached 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and not even the cottonwood trees could shade Purusha from the heat. Soon, it would be time for the monks to eat their single meal of the day. It would be made and served at the temple by a member of the community whose gift of time and food would count as service merits along the path to enlightenment. After lunch, Purusha would check in with the temple's newest resident, a 75-year-old nun from Thailand who had moved into the temple just 3 weeks earlier. Visiting her was her 17-year-old grandson and novice monk, an American high school student named Matthew. Purusha stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and robes, and then he turned and walked back down the path to the side entrance of the temple that he had been standing in earlier. Before stepping back inside, he took off his sandals, and he enjoyed the smell of cooking rice wafting out from the kitchen. Once inside, Purusha closed the door behind him, and then he stood there quietly for a moment. He let go of all the noise he was hearing both inside and outside of his mind. Then he opened his eyes and stepped into the nearby kitchen, and he left his handful of freshly picked herbs on the counter. At 8:30 a.m. the next day, Saturday, August 10th, Betty Kraft called the temple. At the local well last night, she and Purusha had seen that their water distribution was scheduled for that day, the 10th. But that morning, Betty had found out that the distribution was going to start a bit earlier than usual, so she was calling Purusha to let him know, and she wanted to remind him, again, to make sure the temple's water head gate was closed. But after dialing the number to the temple, the phone didn't ring, it was just silent. Betty didn't know why this was, and after trying again and still getting nothing, she decided to just hop in her car and make the short drive over to the temple to tell Purusha in person. A few minutes later, Betty drove through the open gates of the concrete wall that surrounded the temple's 5-acre lot, and she pulled into the temple's parking area and parked her car. Getting out, she walked over to the side entrance that she knew led into the monks' living quarters. Once there, Betty quickly saw that the temple's hoses were open. Water was running out of them. But it struck her as odd that Purusha had not arranged the hoses so that all the water would run into his gardens. Instead, some of the water had started to collect on the little patio right outside the door and was even overflowing into the parking lot down below. Betty felt even more puzzled when she knocked on the side door and didn't get an answer. The same thing happened when she walked around to the front entrance that led directly into the large square temple sanctuary where the monks conducted services. Not only did no one answer either door, but everything inside the building seemed unusually quiet. But not wanting to enter the monk's space without an invitation, and checking once more that the grounds were empty, Betty shrugged her shoulders. At least she knew that the temple's hoses were on and the head gate was closed. So she jumped back into her car and returned to her own property. 2 hours later, at 10:40 a.m., another car drove through the open gates of the temple into the front parking lot. Inside the car were 2 Thai women who were friends and who were both members of the temple. They were there to make the monks' Saturday meal. When the car came to a stop, the two women looked around and noticed something strange. There was not a single person outside working in the vegetable gardens or walking on the meditation paths. The women figured there must be a reason for this, so they just got out and headed for the front door of the temple. But before they could reach the door, they had to walk around this large puddle of water that had formed in front of the temple from all of the water pouring out of the open hoses. The women wondered why the hoses had not been adjusted to aim in other directions, but ultimately they ignored the growing puddle, and one of the women reached out and grabbed the front door handle, but when she pulled it, she saw it was locked. This was now the third irregularity that the two women had spotted in the span of just a couple of minutes. 51-year-old Chawi Borders and her friend, Primshat Hash, were starting to get a bad feeling about what they were seeing at the temple. Something just felt off. But they quickly reminded themselves that they needed to just focus on what they were doing at the temple, not what the monks might be doing. They were there to make lunch and earn service merits. And besides, the two women agreed that the monks must just be inside studying or meditating, and as for the water and locked door, the monks must have just forgotten to turn off the irrigation system and open the front door to the sanctuary. So the two women left the front door and headed around to the unlocked side entrance. They took off their shoes outside and then stepped inside. The room they walked into was the dining room. To their left was a door that led to the kitchen. Straight in front of them was that large square temple worship area. And then to their right was a hallway that led down to 5 bedrooms that made up the monks' living quarters. The women turned left and went straight into the kitchen and got to work preparing the monks' lunch. But they hadn't been there for very long before Primshat thought she'd discovered the reason for at least some of the irregularities they had witnessed that morning. As she had walked from the kitchen back toward the side entrance to go back outside and get something from the car, she had glanced quickly down the hallway that led to the monks' 5 bedrooms, and at the front of that hallway, close to where she was a small sitting area with a couple of sofas inside. And in this sitting area, Primshat saw the monks were lying quietly on the floor between these 2 sofas. After getting what she needed from the car, Primshat returned to the kitchen and told her friend Chawi that she had just seen the monks in the sitting area and that they were either sleeping or praying. Not wanting to disturb them, the 2 women went about their meal preparation very quietly, and at some point, when Chawi thought she heard the faint ring of a phone, she immediately stepped out of the kitchen into the dining room to answer the phone before the sound could interrupt the monk's concentration or rest. But when she put the phone to her ear, she heard nothing. Thinking she must have picked up the wrong phone, as there was 2 phones in the dining room, she walked across the room to the other phone and put that phone to her ear, but this as well was silent. But as she stood there with this silent phone pressed to her ear, she looked at the first phone she had picked up, and she could tell right away that the cord connecting the receiver to the phone had been cut. Then she pulled the phone in her hand away from her ear, and she saw the same thing. The phone's cord was cut. As she realized that clearly she had not heard a phone ring because now she's seeing neither phone would work, Chawi just happened to glance at the sitting room at the front of the hallway where the monks were lying on the floor in various attitudes of prayer. And almost absently, she noticed that mixed among the colorful saffron robes that the monks wore was the long white shirt and pants worn by the elderly nun who had joined the monastery with her grandson just a few weeks ago. Chawi was suddenly very uneasy. She knew that could not possibly be right. It was absolutely forbidden that a male monk who took strict vows of celibacy would ever lie down next to a woman, let alone lie close enough that their bodies or robes would be touching. As Chawi stood there frozen, her friend Primshat stepped out into the dining room as well and began to let out this terrible wail. Because something else was horribly wrong with what the 2 women were looking at. There was blood everywhere in the sitting area. There was blood on the floor, on the walls, and on the 2 sofas. It was 11:09 a.m. that Saturday morning when the emergency call came in to the dispatcher at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. Chawi and Primshat, who were totally hysterical, had run barefoot to the house of a neighbor who had called 911. By 11:21 a.m., the first law enforcement officer had skidded to a stop in the temple parking lot, and 3 minutes later, 4 more officers had arrived. By 11:45 a.m., the perimeter of the temple grounds had been marked off with yellow crime scene tape, and the parking lot was full of police and medical personnel. And the news had already spread like wildfire through the Buddhist community and among local, state, and national media. It was also making headlines back in Thailand because the temple was now the site of the worst mass murder in Arizona history. Inside that small sitting room, police had found 9 people, every single inhabitant of the temple, including the abbot, Parush, all of them dead. Physical evidence at the scene did not paint a complete picture, but it did allow police to establish a few theories about what happened. There had been at least 2 killers. On the carpet near the victims were 17 .22 caliber casings and 3 spent shotgun shells. A nearby storage room had been sprayed with a fire extinguisher, and in the foam on the floor, police counted 2 different size sets of footprints made by people wearing combat-style boots. These small monastic cubicles where the monks slept had been ransacked and vandalized. The sleeping mats had been pulled off of the wooden bed frames, and what little furniture there was had been broken and knocked to the ground. Police were also able to determine that the killers had found the temple safe, but they had not been able to open it. What puzzled investigators was the fact that the temple's worship area, which was that large square room not far from the sitting area where the bodies had been found, appeared to be untouched, despite the fact that in the worship area, right near the altar, was a visible money tree with at least 20 bills still clipped to the branches. So if this had been a robbery, why didn't the robbers take those bills? Whoever had committed the crime had also left another clue behind. Overlaying the stench of clotting blood, spent ammunition, and human flesh that had already begun to decompose, there was also the smell of something else that was completely out of place in a Buddhist monastery, the stale but strong scent of cigarette smoke. Even as the first responders to the crime scene went about their grisly work of photographing the dead and collecting evidence, the sheriff of Maricopa County, 55-year-old Tom Agnos, knew his department was in way over its head trying to deal with a mass murder. So he immediately began the process of pulling together a multi-agency task force to help investigate the crime, process the crime scene, and collect and analyze any forensic evidence. But before the police could even write up their preliminary crime scene report, and just hours after the bodies had been discovered, along with the media, hundreds of members of the Asian community in and around Phoenix were gathering outside the temple wall. In the 101-degree Fahrenheit heat, reporters had already begun to broadcast and air interviews, putting forward wildly different and competing theories about possible motives for the killings. Some reports speculated that the murders were a robbery or a hate crime directed at the Asian and Buddhist communities. Others speculated that the killings were gang-related or drug-related, that maybe the temple itself or some of the monks or temple residents had direct connections to the growing trade in heroin coming out of Thailand into the United States. Meanwhile, based on their discussions with Betty Kraft, who had met with Parush at the local well in Waddell at 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 9th, along with findings from the medical examiner's office, the investigators were able to narrow down the time of the murders to between 2 and 4 a.m. on the morning of August 10th. But despite all the evidence of violence and destruction left at the crime scene, by August 12th, 2 days after the mass murder, the best lead that investigators had was just a report of a red SUV, a Ford Bronco with a white stripe, that had been seen by several different witnesses driving away from the area where the temple was located around the time that the murders were likely to have been committed. Over the next few weeks, more than 60 law enforcement personnel would follow up on more than 500 leads, including that report of the red Ford Bronco, but none of those leads would pan out. Officers dug into the private lives of the 9 victims, but they just could not come up with any person or group who might have wanted one of them or all of them dead. Members of the Asian community had raised a $10,000 reward for information leading to the killers, but no one had come forward with anything useful. But almost exactly 1 month after the murders, the task force would receive what they believed was their first real break in the case. On Monday, September 10th, police in Tucson, Arizona, called the Special Task Force headquarters in Phoenix, saying they had just gotten a tip related to the mass murder. The tip had come in that morning from a 24-year-old patient at the Tucson Psychiatric Institute who had checked himself into the facility after attempting suicide. The patient, who gave police several false names before giving them his real name, Michael Lawrence McGraw, was known in his hometown neighborhood of South Tucson by yet another name, Crazy Mike. He told Tucson police that he had something to say about, quote, some kind of murders that happened in Phoenix at the Buddhist temple. As soon as they got this tip, investigators drove to Tucson and went through the administrative process of getting Mike released from the psychiatric hospital so they could drive him back to Phoenix for questioning. Once that was done and Crazy Mike was in Phoenix, investigators at the task force headquarters spent the next 3 days questioning him during interrogations that sometimes lasted longer than 12 hours at a stretch. Between sessions, Mike was taken to a 4-star Sheraton hotel and treated to room service, but he was never allowed to sleep for more than a few hours at a stretch, and he did not have a lawyer with him for the interrogations. Eventually, Crazy Mike confessed to the temple murders, although audio recordings of the interrogation showed that Mike needed and got a lot of help from his interrogators before he actually got the details of the crime straight. On September 13th, 3 days after Mike had been brought in for questioning, police had arrested 4 other men from Tucson that Mike had said were also involved in the killings. All 4 of the accused were acquaintances of Mike, and all 4 were subjected to the same interrogation techniques that detectives had employed when they had questioned Mike. And 3 of the 4 men confessed to the murders and were immediately charged with multiple homicides. The 4th man had a solid alibi and just refused to yield to what the courts would later describe as questionable interrogation techniques by the task force. But by late September, the case against the so-called Tucson 4, which was Crazy Mike and the 3 other men who confessed, quickly fell apart. Each of the suspects recanted their confessions, saying they were, quote, coerced by investigators who frightened them, gave them details about the case, and told them that their friends had already implicated them in the crime, end quote. Not only were investigators back to square one, but the botched interrogations of the Tucson 4 had resulted in public outcry and criticism of the police and caused divisions inside of the task force, which now numbered more than 200 people. The real first break in the Waddell Temple massacre would not come until October 24th, 6 weeks after the killings. And that break was actually based on a lead that the police had gotten 1 month earlier on September 21st and had just failed to follow up on. It would turn out that on the same day that Crazy Mike phoned the Tucson Police Department on September 21st, saying he had information about the murders, investigators for the Special Task Force had also received a tip from the Office of Special Investigations at the Luke Air Force Base. Luke Air Force Base is located about 6 miles east of the Waddell Temple. The Office of Special Investigations, which is the name of the military police unit that provides law enforcement on the base, had notified the task force that they had picked up a weapon from someone driving on base, and the weapon matched the description of the one used in the Temple massacre. But in all the excitement of getting the phone tip from Crazy Mike at the psychiatric hospital and having a real live suspect to interrogate, task force detectives did not send this weapon in for testing. Instead, after picking the weapon up from Luke Air Force Base, one of the sergeants on the task force literally put the weapon behind a door in a corner of his office, and then he forgot about it until 4 weeks later when the case against the Tucson 4 started to implode. At that point, with the task force scrambling for new leads, the sergeant remembered the weapon and they would send it off for testing at the Arizona State Crime Lab. The results of that test came back 4 days later on October 24th, and 2 days after that, on October 26th, investigators arrested 2 people in connection with the mass murder. And the story that these 2 people would tell police left even the most hardened detectives feeling shocked and repulsed. Based on the testimony of these 2 individuals, here is a reconstruction of what really happened in the early morning hours of Saturday, August 10th, inside the Waddell Temple. The last communication between the residents of the Waddell Temple and the outside world happened at about 11 p.m. on the night of Friday, August 9th. Perush, the abbot of the temple, had already come back from his meeting at the local well with neighbor Betty Kraft. Other monks had also returned to the temple after performing a blessing ceremony at the house of one of the temple members earlier that evening. At 11, one of the monks telephoned the woman who had prepared that day's noontime meal, asking if she would like to return to the temple the next day, Saturday, an offer she later told police she had declined. After 11 p.m., finished with their daily routine of meditation, prayer, work, and teaching, 4 of the temple's residents made their way to the small sitting room to talk and watch TV. The temple's gentle 75-year-old nun, who had spent most of her life in Thailand doing the back-breaking work of planting and harvesting rice, had made her way to her tiny sleeping quarters, less a bedroom than a closet, that had just enough space inside for a simple sleeping mat, but which gave her the required physical separation from the monks. But just as the evening was coming to a close for the residents of the temple, the night was just getting started for 2 local teenage boys. One 16 years old and one 17 years old. This was a night, in fact, that had been a long time in the making. 3 months earlier, one of the teens' brothers had told them that the Wadel temple was full of riches like golden Buddha statues and a safe full of money. And this brother would know because he had actually spent 6 weeks that summer living in the temple as a novice monk. And so the 16-year-old and the 17-year-old became obsessed with this temple and these riches. But as they thought more and more about robbing the temple, they realized they weren't just interested in the money. They were also interested in treating this robbery like it was a full-scale military operation. And they both agreed that for this military operation to be successful, they would have to pull it off without leaving any witnesses. So back in June of 1991, while Parush and his fellow monks were out in the temple gardens just starting to plant melons, basil, corn, and sweet potatoes, the 2 teens started preparing for their robbery/war game. Both of the boys had fathers who worked at the nearby Luke Air Force Base, so the boys went to the base store and over a period of time bought the gear they needed. Boots, camouflage hats, scarves, military belts and goggles, battle harnesses, and military knives and flashlights. Getting the weapons wasn't hard either. The 16-year-old boy had access to his father's 20-gauge pump-action shotgun that he loaded up with birdshot. When you fire birdshot, it's like firing a cluster of small metal BBs all at once. And the 17-year-old would borrow a .22 caliber rifle from an unsuspecting acquaintance. By late summer, after weeks of talk and planning, the 2 teen boys had settled on a date. They'd arrive at the temple late on the night of Friday, August 9th, when they knew all the monks would be inside the temple. So just before midnight on that Friday night, the 2 boys, dressed in their full military outfits and driving an older model Mustang, turned off the car headlights as they rolled through the open gates of the temple and parked the car in the far corner of the parking lot. The boys pulled on their gloves and then checked to make sure their guns were loaded and that all the gear they would need was either hooked onto their bodies or in their respective duffel bags. Then, after nodding to one another, they put their big goggles over their eyes, pulled their hats down tight over their foreheads, and pulled their scarves up around their nose and mouths. Then they got out of the car and began walking toward the side door of the temple that led into the dining room. Just after midnight on August 10th, the quiet inside the temple was suddenly shattered. The 4 monks in the sitting area heard a bang as the side door was suddenly flung open, and a moment later, 2 people dressed in military gear were dragging them out of their seats. The air was filled with shouts, "Hit the dirt, down on the floor, now, now, now!" As the monks stumbled first to their feet and then to their knees, they stared in shock at these intruders who seemed to have just come out of nowhere. It was impossible to see the boys' faces, but the monks saw that one of the attackers was over 6 feet tall and must have weighed over 200 pounds. Up close, both of the boys smelled like beer, cigarettes, and sweat. But the monks hardly had time to process any of this before the intruders split up, one of them screaming and waving a long-barreled gun as he circled the 4 monks who were now kneeling on the floor in the 6-foot-wide space between the 2-person and 6-person sofas on opposite sides of the sitting area. Meanwhile, the other intruder ran down that narrow hallway leading to the temple's 5 bedrooms, where he dragged the remaining 2 monks, 1 novice monk, and the temple helper back to the sitting room, where they also were forced at gunpoint to join the circle of monks in the cramped space between the sofas. It was obvious after one look in the monks' bare, empty bedrooms that this temple was not full of riches like the boys had hoped. But that didn't stop the two boys from taking turns vandalizing, smashing, and destroying everything in front of them. And when one of the boys pulled open the door of the final room at the end of the hallway, which was really just a large closet, cowering on her knees right in front of him was the temple's oldest resident, the tiny 75-year-old nun and grandmother who had only arrived at the temple 3 weeks earlier with her 17-year-old grandson. Grabbing hold of her white shirt dress, the intruder dragged her back to the sitting area and then forced her to take her place amongst the others. After an hour spent ransacking the living quarters and temple office, the only treasure the two boys had found was a safe that they could not figure out how to open, and some envelopes of cash offerings from members of the temple. So, frustrated, the two boys would spend their second hour in the temple, switching back and forth between terrorism and more destruction. Taking turns, they circled their kneeling captives, stepping on their legs and backs, prodding them with the barrels of the rifle and the shotgun, and jumping on and off the seats of the sofa as they made their way around and around, demanding the combination to the safe and the location of any hidden valuables they were sure the monks must have somewhere. And as they tortured and degraded the 9 people in front of them, the boys smoked one cigarette after another, blowing the smoke into their captives' faces and crushing out the butt of each cigarette in a big glass ashtray that they had placed in the center of their human circle. But from the very first moment that the boys had broken into the temple, the response from the monks totally threw them off. These were not people who wanted to fight or argue or beg or even resist. Instead, the more violent and threatening the boys became, the less of a reaction they got from their victims. Instead, the monks looked around the circle and calmly made faces of encouragement at the terrified novice monk and the temple helper, who just went by the simple name of Boy, and the 75-year-old nun. At some point, Perush laced his fingers together in prayer and began to chant. The other 5 monks, who, like him, had spent years learning to accept, without question or resistance, every moment and circumstance in their lives, joined him. In Buddhism, one of the greatest meditations of all is the meditation on the inevitability of death. And as Perush looked from face to face around the circle, he wanted each one of them to know that however and whenever death came, it would bring the gift of rebirth and enlightenment. So even as the intruders physically and verbally assaulted them, trying to get them to not only give up the code to the safe, but to react to their captors with fear, Perush and the other monks just continued to mentally withdraw into the calm space of their meditation and prayer. And their strength appeared to give the other non-monks the resolve they needed to relax and be calm as well. And before long, the 17-year-old novice monk, the temple worker they called Boy, and the 75-year-old nun had all bowed their heads as well and closed their eyes. And so by the time the bigger of the 2 boys finally lifted the barrel of his shotgun and fired 4 rounds into the circle of kneeling figures, blowing off kneecaps and fingers and sending birdshot into the soft skin of necks and faces, his victims had already left the world of flesh and blood behind. As the victims silently absorbed the blasts from the shotgun, the second intruder walked up behind one of the victims, he raised his rifle, and he fired 2 shots into the back of their head. As the victims slumped forward with their hands still laced together in front of their chest in prayer, the other 8 victims didn't make a sound. They just continued to pray and meditate, knowing they were next. For the next several minutes, the second attacker slowly made his way around the circle, systematically putting at least 2 rounds into the back of each of the victims' skulls. After making sure that all 9 people inside the temple were dead, the 2 intruders packed up the money and personal items they had stolen from the temple and headed back out the side door. They ran back to their car, pulling the scarves down from their sweat-soaked faces, and began gulping in the hot, dry, and clean desert air. And then they drove out through the open gates of the Buddhist temple and back into their everyday normal lives. Except that 12 days later, on August 21st, military police on Luke Air Force Base found a .22 caliber rifle in the trunk of a car they had pulled over for suspicious activity. The rifle belonged to the driver, who had just recently loaned the weapon to the passenger with him in the car, a 17-year-old teenager named Jonathan Duty. It wasn't until 1 month later, September 20th, that the police report describing the traffic stop and the weapon would find its way to the task force investigating the mass murder, and it would be 4 weeks after that before members of the task force would finally get around to having that weapon tested and find that it was the murder weapon used in the Temple massacre. Once those results came back in, it would take 2 days for task force investigators to track the rifle back to 17-year-old Jonathan Duty and to his accomplice, a 16-year-old named Alex Garcia, who was 6 foot 3 inches tall and who weighed 220 pounds. Alex was the first to confess to the murders, saying that Jonathan was both the mastermind of the robbery and the one who walked around the ring of victims and shot them all in the head, execution style. It was also Jonathan Duty's half-brother, who had spent time as a novice monk living in the temple that summer, who had said there were riches inside of the temple. When the boys were asked why they committed this horrible crime, Jonathan told police he just wanted to get money to buy a car, and Alex told police he wanted, quote, walk-around money that would impress the girls. As for why they had killed everyone, they said they were just following their plan to not leave any witnesses behind. Although, despite claiming to have this well-thought-out military-style robbery all planned out going into the temple, it was fairly obvious that once the boys actually got inside, violence and destruction became the focus, not the robbery. This is likely why the boys did not take that money that was just sitting in plain sight near the altar in the worship room. At the end of the attack, Jonathan and Alex had left the temple with just under $2,800, 2 stereos, 6 cheap cameras, a low-end video recorder, a pair of binoculars, and a handheld bullhorn. In addition to their confessions, forensic analysis of the shoe prints and the saliva left on the cigarette butts found at the temple also conclusively linked the boys to the killing and the crime scene. After 3 different trials, both teenagers were finally convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Tucson 4, who were falsely accused and arrested for the murders, were released from jail on November 2nd after Jonathan and Alex said that no one aside from themselves was involved in the Temple murders and robbery. In 1994, Maricopa County paid the Tucson 4 $2.8 million in damages for false arrests and defamation. Within weeks of the mass murders, the Waddell Temple reopened under the leadership of Abbot Winai Booncham, a Thai monk who had been longtime friends with Perush. Booncham said that after he had taken his friend's body back to Thailand to be cremated, Perush started appearing to Booncham in his dreams. And even though the temple did not reopen as a living and study space for monks until after serious security measures were put in place, Booncham moved into the temple immediately after the murders. When asked why he did that, Booncham said that he saw his friend, Perush, everywhere in the temple, and so he was not afraid.
On the morning of December 18, 2020, 50-year-old Brooke Stroud wandered into her spacious kitchen in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her husband, Stefan, and their 3 young adult children. Brooke shook her head and tried to concentrate as she searched for the cup of coffee she'd brewed earlier. She hadn't been herself the last few days. Her head felt foggy, and little things, like where she'd put her coffee, had been slipping her mind. Brooke spotted the cup in a corner right near their large Viking stove. She grabbed it and headed out of the kitchen and into the formal living room. She slipped on a jacket and went out to the backyard, making a beeline for the separate guest house where she'd set up a home office. It was 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and most businesses all over the country were shut down. Brooke was a clinical psychologist, and she had switched all her in-person sessions to Zoom. This morning, she had a group call, so she set her mug down at her wooden desk, turned on her laptop, and logged into her meeting. As Brooke said hello to the other participants, a wave of exhaustion suddenly washed over her. Her head felt heavy, and every bone in her body was suddenly aching. A scary thought crossed Brooke's mind. Maybe she'd finally gotten COVID, a disease that had already killed 350,000 people in the United States alone. She tried to power through the meeting, but all she could think about was how awful she felt. And so after only a few minutes of being in this meeting, she told everybody on the call that she just wasn't feeling well and asked if they could actually reschedule. After logging out of the Zoom call, Brooke took a minute to collect herself. She didn't think her symptoms seemed like COVID, so she wondered if maybe she was just overdoing it and was maybe tired from the stress of her job. She loved her work, but her hours have been crazy since the pandemic started. More people than ever were turning to therapy to get through these very difficult times. So she decided to cancel the rest of her sessions for the day and just go get some rest. She took the familiar path out of the guest house, through the backyard, and into the main house, walking more slowly than usual. Brooke climbed the winding staircase up to the second floor and into the master bedroom. There she climbed into bed, hoping to sleep off her weariness. Hours later, around noon, Brooke blinked her eyes open. Groggily, she sat up and felt around the bed. Her crisp white sheets were now totally damp with sweat. Brooke touched her forehead and realized she was burning up. She stumbled out of her bed and into the bathroom to take her temperature, and she saw it was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and so she knew she was officially sick. Brooke tried to figure out what to do. She needed to get herself tested for COVID as soon as possible, but at-home COVID tests were not available at this time, which meant she'd have to set up an appointment with her doctor. Until she had the results, she could stay in her bedroom to avoid infecting her family potentially, but then she realized it was likely too late to actually isolate herself. Her youngest kids, 19-year-old Alex and 17-year-old Olivia, had come home from college and boarding school for the holidays a few days earlier, and they were probably already exposed to whatever Brooke had. So she decided it likely made the most sense to just kind of go about her day as usual, but at the same time, try to keep her distance from the kids and her husband. So Brooke put her hair up in a messy bun and headed downstairs. A few hours later, Brooke gathered everyone for dinner. She sat at one end of their long table, while Stefan and the kids were at the other. Brooke wasn't up to cooking, so she ordered takeout from an Italian place, and the table was overflowing with pastas and salads. Alex and Olivia piled their plates high. They always had big appetites when they came home after months of school cafeteria food. Brooke was glad to see her kids eating, but for her, her fever was still burning, and she felt barely hungry at all. She pushed her pasta around her plate as her kids talked about what their semesters had been like with all the COVID protocols. Alex went to college in North Carolina, and Olivia was a high school senior at the same all-girls boarding school in Virginia that Brooke had actually attended. Brooke's oldest child, Sebastian, went to college in Vermont and wouldn't be home for a few days. Brooke really hoped she'd feel better by then, so they could all spend the holidays together, stress-free. Alex looked excited as he told them all about school, but Brooke could see the sadness in Olivia's eyes as she talked about the way COVID restrictions had basically ruined campus life. Normally, she played on a few different sports teams, but the pandemic had put all of them on hold. Brooke felt sorry for Olivia. Even though the pandemic was hurting everybody, she knew her daughter was having an especially hard time. She had looked forward to being a senior for so long, and now that she was, everything seemed to be falling apart. But Brooke's job was to be Olivia's mom, not her therapist, and they were all trying to figure out how to adjust to this new normal. After everyone was done eating, Brooke suggested they watch an old Christmas movie. Brooke took a seat at the opposite end of the couch from Stefan and the kids, and then willed herself to stay awake. Even after napping for several hours that day, she was still exhausted. About halfway through the movie, Brooke noticed her husband massaging his temples, and he also had a strained look on his face. She asked him what was wrong, and he explained his head was pounding. Brooke suggested he go check his temperature. Maybe he had a fever too. They paused the TV, and Stefan headed upstairs, holding onto the banister for support. A few minutes later, Brooke heard him vomiting. So she mustered what little strength she had left and ran up to find him leaning over the toilet bowl. She rubbed Stefan's back, trying to soothe him, but then she heard Alex and Olivia yell for her. Brooke told her husband she'd be right back, and she retraced her footsteps back to the living room. There, she found Alex and Olivia lying on the couch, clutching their heads in their hands as well. They complained that they also had terrible headaches. Brooke turned to go get them some water from the kitchen, while Alex shot up from the couch and ran to the guest bathroom. A second later, Brooke heard him retching too. And as if on cue, Olivia started dry heaving as well. Brooke ran to the kitchen at this point and grabbed a trash can, and she made it back to the living room just in time to set the bin in front of her daughter as she threw up all of her dinner. The following afternoon, Brooke and Stefan sat next to each other inside of a small exam room at their family doctor's office. Brooke had woken up that morning feeling like she'd barely gotten any sleep, even though she'd slept through the entire night, and the rest of her family felt just as bad, so Brooke had decided to get herself and Stefan checked for COVID. Brooke pulled her mask down under her nose, leaving just enough room for the nurse to insert a long nasal swab into her left nostril. It went so far back that it felt like Brooke's brain was being tickled. Her eyes teared up at the sensation, and she stifled a sneeze. The nurse rotated the swab around her nose for several seconds until it was coated with fluid, and then she repeated the same thing in Brooke's right nostril. And then she did the whole process all over again for Stefan. The nurse explained it would take about 24 hours for them to receive the test results by email. Then she took the swabs and left the room, while Brooke and Stefan checked out at the front desk. The next day, December 20th, 2020, Brooke stared at an email she had gotten from her doctor on her phone. She and Stefan were both negative for COVID, which was great, but they still felt horrible, and so clearly they were sick with something. Brooke decided to call Alex and Olivia's pediatrician to see if the kids should get tested for COVID too. But their doctor explained that it probably didn't make sense since Brooke and Stefan already tested negative. Whatever germs they had would have already infected the kids, but very, very likely it was not COVID. So the doctor recommended that everybody in the family just stay home, get some rest, drink lots of fluids, and surely this whole thing will just pass. However, a few days later, Brooke woke up aching all over still. Her fever had stayed steady at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, clouding her mind. The rest of her family felt just as bad too. Their headaches had never really gone away, and some mornings they still woke up feeling very nauseous. But Brooke fought through the fatigue and dragged herself out to her office in the guest house. She knew she was supposed to focus on resting and powering up her immune system, but she felt a responsibility to her clients. Her family was not the only one struggling right now during this weird holiday season. So Brooke settled in at her desk and logged into her first Zoom call. And as she took notes and chatted with other clients throughout the day, she felt herself perk up a bit. Slowly, her headache subsided, and the exhaustion that had usually overpowered her these last few days began to lift. Brooke thought about how good it felt to focus on other people for a change. Around 5 p.m., she wrapped up her sessions and made her way back to the house. She felt optimistic for the first time in a while that maybe she was finally getting over this illness. And so, Brooke, feeling really good, decided she would surprise the family by cooking a nice dinner. An hour later, Brooke called her whole family over to the dining room. She'd grilled some nice, thick steaks, figuring they could all use the protein. Brooke smiled as she doled out plates of food, silently telling herself that they would all be better by Christmas. She'd gotten sick before everybody else, so it made sense that she was recovering sooner too. But as Brooke took a bite of this food she made, she suddenly felt all that heaviness in her head and body start to creep back in. She told herself it was nothing, ignoring the queasiness that was growing in her stomach, and she managed to swallow a few bites of food before she just gave up. And she could see that the rest of her family also could not stomach their food either. Brooke watched Olivia push her salad around listlessly. She was usually so bubbly and full of life, but tonight, just like the rest of them, she looked defeated. Brooke sighed and began clearing their plates covered with uneaten food. After cleaning up, it took all the strength she had left just to shuffle upstairs and fall into her bed. The next afternoon, December 23rd, Brooke heard the front door open. She'd spent all morning in bed, but now she gathered the energy to limp down the stairs to the foyer, her muscles weak from this mystery illness and lack of physical activity. Her hair was matted, and she was wearing the same sweatpants and sweatshirt she'd been in for the past few days. But she managed a weak smile at the sight of her son, Sebastian, standing there with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, finally home from his college in Vermont. He looked fit and healthy, the rosiness in his cheeks a stark contrast to the paleness of her own face. She'd warned Sebastian that his family was not feeling well, but he joked that, nobody was feeling well these days. After all, it's the pandemic. And he said he would rather get sick at home than spend the holidays somewhere else without his family. Brooke stood at the bottom step, trying to keep her distance from her son, even as she told him how happy she was that he was home. But Sebastian just laughed and pulled her into a big bear hug. Brooke allowed him to wrap his arms around her, a sense of relief washing over her. A few hours later, the whole family sat in the living room eating cheese and crackers, while Sebastian told them all about his fall semester at college. As he described the off-campus house where he lived, Brooke saw Sebastian slowly sink into the couch, and his voice started to sound fatigued. She asked him if he felt okay, and Sebastian said he was just tired from finishing up his last paper for school and then catching a flight home. Brooke smiled and suggested he go to his room and get some rest. But inside, Brooke started worrying that Sebastian might be coming down with this same mystery illness that was dogging the rest of them. A couple of days after Christmas, Brooke's daughter Olivia woke up with a throbbing headache just as she had every morning since coming home. Her muscles still ached and she still didn't feel rested at all. In fact, it felt like she could sleep for another 5 hours, and even that probably wouldn't be enough. Olivia looked around her room, noticing all the tissues and dirty clothes she had scattered on the carpet. Usually she kept her space very nice and tidy, but she didn't have the energy or motivation to clean or do much of anything, really. So far, her winter break had been a total disaster. Olivia had expected the holidays to be different because of the COVID pandemic, but she'd hoped to have at least some fun. Now, the only silver lining was her upcoming trip to visit Caroline, her best friend from school who lived in New Orleans. Then, the plan was for them to fly back to DC together and spend 2 more weeks in isolation at Olivia's house. Their boarding school wanted all students to quarantine before returning for the spring semester, so they were going to do that together in DC. But Olivia was now worried that the family's mystery illness could ruin her visit to Caroline's house too. So, Olivia asked her parents to please set up an appointment with her pediatrician that afternoon. If doctors could just figure out what was making her sick, maybe Olivia could get the right treatment in time to go visit her friend. The next day, Olivia sat down next to her very ragged-looking mom at the kitchen table. Brooke blew on the steaming cup of tea in front of her, cooling it down before taking a long sip. She had purple bags under her eyes and her hair was a total mess. Olivia obviously knew her mom was not feeling great, none of them were, but she needed her mom's attention right now. She gathered up her willpower, pushing away the nausea and exhaustion she felt, and reminded herself of the argument she'd practiced. She was determined to see her friend Caroline and get back to living her life. First, Olivia gave her mom a rundown of her visit to the pediatrician the previous day. Dr. Stein had given her a COVID test just to be safe. She also checked for parvovirus, which causes mild respiratory illness, and Epstein-Barr virus, a common illness that would be making Olivia very drowsy. Olivia explained to her mom that all the results had come back negative. Then, before Brooke could even respond, Olivia launched into the speech she'd prepared. She told her mother, since she didn't have any of those viruses or COVID, she should be able to go see Caroline. All she was doing here was sitting at the house and watching TV, and after saying this, Olivia just went quiet and watched her mom consider her words. She could see the wheels in her mother's mind turning, and for a moment, it seemed like her mom might actually agree with her. But before Olivia could celebrate her victory, her mom's face got serious, and she began to speak in a very soft voice. Brooke explained that she, Olivia, her daughter, was already sick, and she couldn't risk traveling and getting worse, even if she didn't know what the sickness was. Olivia immediately huffed in frustration and thought about arguing more with her mom, but as upsetting as this was, she knew her mom was right. She did feel terrible, and clearly whatever she had likely was contagious because her whole family had it. So Olivia turned and headed up the stairs to her bedroom, her breathing ragged and her spirits deflated. Brooke sighed as she heard Olivia kind of stomping around upstairs, obviously still very upset, and Brooke couldn't help but feel sorry for her teenage daughter. This holiday season wasn't what any of them were expecting, but it seemed like Olivia was really taking it the hardest. She thrived on interacting with people, and she had already been through a semester at school full of remote classes and social distancing because of COVID. This trip to New Orleans was supposed to be her big chance to go have some fun and explore a new city with a very close friend. Brooke wondered if there was anything she could do to salvage the rest of Olivia's break. She stood up from the couch, fighting off the dizziness that came whenever she moved too quickly, and just then a thought crossed her mind. Brooke grabbed her phone off the coffee table and made her way outside to the backyard and began looking through her contacts until she found the name John Schifflian, who was Caroline's dad. Brooke paced around the garden as she spoke to John, savoring the fresh air, and she explained to him what had been going on at her house and that unfortunately, Olivia was too sick to travel to New Orleans to see Caroline. Brooke was very clear that her whole family had the same bug as Olivia, and that doctors had been unable to figure out what it was, but they did eliminate COVID-19. It was not that. Then Brooke made her pitch to John. Instead of having her daughter Olivia fly to New Orleans, she suggested that Caroline come to stay with them in Washington, D.C. If Caroline came here, she and Olivia could spend time together and hole up in the house and do their required 2 weeks of quarantine before returning to school together. Now, Brooke knew that a lot of parents would immediately reject the idea of sending their child to a house where everybody is sick. But Caroline's father, John Schifflian, was no ordinary parent. He was an infectious disease specialist at Tulane University's medical school. He studied survivors of some of the world's worst infectious diseases, and probably had more information about COVID-19 than anyone else Brooke knew. And so if he was okay with Caroline coming to DC, Brooke was confident that it really was safe. After Brooke made her pitch, there was a few moments of awkward silence, and then John responded. It was widely understood that the longer somebody was sick, whether with COVID or something else, the less infectious the illness becomes to others. If Caroline visited, she likely wouldn't get sick at all, or she'd get a milder version of whatever Brooke's family had. Regardless, she wouldn't be in any significant danger. And also, John knew his daughter would totally go for this idea. She wanted to see her friend. And so ultimately, John agreed to the idea. Brooke thanked John and assured him that she'd do everything she could to make sure Caroline was safe. John thanked her, and then they hung up, and then Brooke practically ran into the house to tell her daughter the great news. A few days later, in early January of 2021, Brooke made her way to the front door of her house. Before she could reach for the handle, Olivia came bolting out of the kitchen and shooed her mom out of the way with more energy than Brooke had seen in weeks. Her daughter was practically jumping with excitement. Olivia threw open the door and immediately wrapped her arms around Caroline. As Brooke watched her daughter light up, she told herself this was the right decision. She turned to Caroline and told her she was welcome to take her mask off. She'd be here for the next 2 weeks anyway, and her dad was aware of the situation. Caroline and Olivia grinned at each other, then they took Caroline's bag and headed upstairs to Olivia's room. A few hours later, Brooke was sitting in the guest house catching up on her paperwork when her daughter Olivia came rushing inside. In a panicked voice, she explained that Caroline had a splitting headache and was currently in the bathroom throwing up. Brooke shot out of her chair, dizziness and anxiety bubbling up inside of her at the same time. Brooke couldn't believe what she'd done. She'd promised John that his daughter would be safe here. Now she was just as sick as the rest of them. Brooke followed Olivia out of the guest house and back to the main house, fighting off dizzying vertigo with every step. The next evening, on January 5th, 2021, Brooke stood outside the bedroom where Caroline was staying. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was asleep or not. Brooke gently knocked, and a few seconds later, Caroline opened up. Brooke realized that Caroline was actually on a video call on her phone, and she quickly apologized, saying she could come back later. But Caroline said don't worry about it, she was on the phone with her dad. Seizing the opportunity, Brooke asked if she could speak to him for a second. Caroline handed over the phone, and Brooke told John she was absolutely mortified at the way his daughter's visit had gone so far. She repeated the apologies she'd been giving Caroline ever since she got sick. But John just waved her apology away. He said it was okay, he'd been the one who signed off on this trip, and he knew that the whole family was sick. And so Brooke felt her anxiety ease a little bit. At least John was not openly blaming her for what was going on with Caroline. However, John wasn't quite finished with his response. He did want to call to Brooke's attention something that Caroline had brought up to him, something very important. Caroline had told him that her symptoms lessened whenever the girls went for a walk around the neighborhood. She also said that people seemed to get very sick very quickly when they came into the main house. That suggested to John that this was not an infectious disease. John thought it was much more likely that it was some kind of environmental illness, meaning there was something in the house doing it. And John actually had a sneaking suspicion about which environmental illness it was. So he recommended that Brooke go to the hardware store as soon as possible. There she could buy a device that would prove John's theory. Brooke was shocked at what she was hearing, but she promised John she would go to the store first thing tomorrow morning, and then she passed the phone back to Caroline, anxious but excited that they might actually finally figure out what was making everybody sick. The next morning, January 6th, 2021, Stefan returned home from the hardware store with this new device in hand. Brooke grabbed her husband by the arm and rushed him inside, eager to see if Caroline's father had been right. She grabbed the device from Stefan and then hit the on button. And right away, the machine began blaring. The kids ran downstairs, shouting over the alarm to ask what was going on. Brooke pointed to the device and told Stefan to explain it to them as she fumbled with her phone. She very quickly dialed 911 and ran out into the yard, explaining to the dispatcher what was going on through panicked breaths. She pleaded with them to hurry. Within minutes, Brooke heard sirens. she rushed to the door and hurried the firefighters inside, showing them the device that was still going off. The uniformed men yelled over the alarm and instructed everyone to go outside and wait while they dealt with whatever was going on inside the house. Brooke ushered Stefan and the kids out the door and across the street. Pretty soon, curious neighbors were standing in small clusters all along the sidewalk, their eyes wide as they took in all the emergency vehicles before them. As they watched the commotion unfold, Brooke turned to Caroline and asked her to call her father. She wanted to tell John he was right. The firefighters would discover that Brooke's family had a serious carbon monoxide leak in their home, and everyone, including Caroline, had carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, or CO for short, is an odorless, colorless gas that kills hundreds of people every year. When somebody has carbon monoxide poisoning, what happens is the carbon monoxide in the air replaces the oxygen in their bloodstream. As a result, the heart, brain, and body are starved of the oxygen they need to survive. The firefighters who responded to Brooke's call quickly figured out that the leak was coming from the basement furnace. A clamp had come loose and was spewing carbon monoxide throughout the 4-story house. That explained why Brooke felt better every time she worked in the guest house, and why Olivia and Caroline had fewer symptoms whenever they were out walking around in the neighborhood. Brooke was shocked that their smoke alarm already in the home didn't warn them about the poisonous gas exposure, but after inspecting the alarm, she realized it didn't have a CO detector at all. It had been installed a year before Washington, D.C. required them in all residences. In the end, Brooke's family and Caroline all recovered well from the CO poisoning. After the leak, Brooke bought 4 plug-in detectors that she installed on each level of the house, but every time she goes into the basement, she can't help but check to see that the furnace is still properly connected.
At 7:20 p.m. on Friday, January 12, 2007, 19-year-old college freshman Wade Steffi walked into Ford Dining Hall, which is one of 5 dining halls on Purdue University's campus. Purdue is a prestigious American university located in Indiana that is known for its excellent athletics and academics. Wade, who was an aviation technology student and was at Purdue on a full academic scholarship, grabbed some food and then sat down at a table with some friends. This was the first Friday of the 2007 spring semester, and so Wade and his friends at the table and the hundreds of other students that were sitting all around them were buzzing with excitement about what they were up to that night and what they were up to that weekend. And so Wade and his friends, they sat there chatting about their plans for about an hour, and then at around 8:20 p.m., Wade realized he needed to leave, and so he stood up, he said goodbye to his friends, he carried his tray to the trash can, and then he made his way out of the doors he came in on. And so once he was outside of the dining hall, he immediately turned right and walked the very short distance to the building that was right next to Ford Dining Hall. And so that building was called Owen Hall, and it was a dormitory. Now, this was not Wade's dormitory. He actually lived in a different dorm called Cary Quad West, which was located on the other side of Ford Dining Hall. And so Wade goes inside of Owen Hall because he has some friends in there, and he makes his way to their room, and when he goes inside, he sees they're all kind of sitting around chatting and drinking some alcoholic drinks. And so Wade sits down and he has a couple of drinks and he just hangs out with his friends for about an hour. And so around 9:30 p.m., Wade and the other people he was with in this room, they left Owen Hall and they walked the half mile away from campus to the west to this huge party at a fraternity. And so Wade would stay at this fraternity for several hours until about midnight, at which point he pulled one of his friends aside and he told them that he just remembered he had left his jacket inside of Owen Hall, and so he wanted to go back and retrieve it. The dorms on Purdue's campus all lock at night, and so the only way you can get inside is if you live there and so you have a key, or if you know someone who lives there who will open the door for you. And so during his walk back to Owen Hall, Wade would make 6 phone calls in an attempt to get someone in Owen Hall to open the door for him. But 4 of his phone calls would just be the wrong number. And so the people that were picking up and he was asking to open the door, they didn't know what he was talking about, and so they hung up. But he did call two people that did live inside of Owen Hall. However, they didn't answer their phones. And so around 12:30 a.m., Wade arrived at Owen Hall. He put his phone back in his pocket, and he just walked up to the doors, which were locked, and he just started knocking. And eventually, a resident of Owen Hall, who didn't know Wade, and Wade didn't know them, they heard the knocking, and they came out to the door to see what was going on, and they looked through the glass, and they saw Wade, and apparently they decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to let into the building, and so they refused him entry. And so Wade apparently stood there. He kept knocking for a little bit, but he eventually just kind of gave up. He turned around and he walked away. Fast forward a few days to Tuesday, January 16th, and Wade's roommate, who had actually been gone all the past weekend, he returned, and the first thing he noticed when he got back to his dorm was that Wade was not in the dorm. And so he called and texted Wade, but he didn't get a response. And so the roommate went out around the floor that they lived on to ask people if they had seen Wade, and no one had seen him since the previous Friday. And so starting to get pretty concerned, the roommate called Wade's family to see if maybe they knew what was going on with him, but his family had no idea. And so by the end of that day, the police had been contacted about Wade potentially being missing, and they in turn contacted Wade's cell phone provider, and they were able to determine that Wade's cell phone was still showing up somewhere on Purdue's campus, although they couldn't figure out exactly where. So that evening, a massive campus-wide search was launched with hundreds of police officers and volunteers. Even the school's equestrian club came out with their horses to search the nearby woods. But despite this huge search effort that would go on for several weeks, the only thing they would find of Wade's was one of his shoes. It was found on January 20th, so just 4 days into the search, and it was located right outside of an exterior door that led into a maintenance room inside of Owen Hall. But when they searched this maintenance room, Wade wasn't in there. Finally, after nearly a month of searching, when they still had not found Wade, the official search was called off. On March 19th, roughly 2 months after Wade had been reported missing, a maintenance worker was downstairs in the laundry room of Owen Hall when they heard a strange popping sound. At first, the worker thought it was actually coming from one of the washers or dryers that was on, and maybe there's a loose coin or some piece of metal that was inside of the washer or dryer that's getting banged around inside, and that's making the sound. And so this worker began walking around the laundry room, kind of listening in to each of the washers and dryers that were on to see if they were making this sound. And so as he's doing this, he hears the popping sound again, but it's clearly not coming from any of the washers and dryers. In fact, it's not even coming from inside the laundry room. It's coming from somewhere out in the hall. Curious, he leaves the laundry room and he goes out into the hall, and as soon as he's standing in the hall, he hears the popping sound again. And this time it was obvious that it was coming from behind the closed door that was directly opposite the laundry room. So the worker pulled out his big set of keys, he opened the door that was directly in front of him, and he stepped inside. Moments later, he would make a big discovery. Based on that discovery and the investigation that would follow it, this is a reconstruction of what happened to Wade Steffi. In the early morning hours of January 13th, right after Wade had been denied entry into Owen Hall because the student who was in there who didn't know him thought he was too intoxicated, right after that happened, Wade left the front doors and made his way around to the left side of the building to look for another way inside. And when he got to the left side of the building, he found another door. Now, even though this door did not have a sign on it that said "keep out," it was fairly obvious that this door was not designed for students to use. There was a metal railing that lined the outside of this door, clearly to prevent pedestrians from getting to the door, and the door itself was actually not built at ground level. It basically was built at basement level, so you'd be standing at this railing looking down at the door, and down in front of the door was a slab of cement right out in front of it that gave the door enough clearance to be able to open. And so basically there was a railing around a pit, and that was where the door was. The proper way to get to this door was to literally climb over that railing and jump down into this pit. And then you'd need a key to open this door because it was always locked. Well, it was supposed to always be locked. And so when Wade saw this clearly off-limits door on the side of Owen Hall, in his drunken state, he decided it would be a good idea to try to go into it. Because in his mind, he thought, whatever is behind this door doesn't really matter. As long as I can just get inside of some part of Owen Hall, I can find my way up to my friend's room and I can get my jacket. And so he rushes over to the railing, he climbs over, he leaps down into that pit area, he grabs the doorknob of this off-limits door and he pulls on it and it's open. So he opens it up, he steps inside, and it's totally pitch black. And all he can hear is the sound of machines humming and whirring in the darkness. And again, in his drunken state, he decides this is still a good idea. His only concern was he couldn't find a light switch, and it really was basically pitch black in here. And he was worried once the door shut, not only would his only light source be totally cut off, but it might actually lock behind him, and then he'd be trapped inside of this room. And so he took off one of his shoes and he tucked it in the door jamb of the door he came in on to keep it open. And so with the door propped open behind him, he began walking into this room. And pretty much right away, he bumped into this big metal structure. He couldn't see what it was because, again, it was too dark, but he could feel it and he could tell, it was a flat metal structure. It felt like a machine of some kind, and he could hear that it was one of the machines that was buzzing and whirring. And so he just decided he would try to walk around it. Because again, his goal is just to get through this room and find another door somewhere and kind of continue his journey up into the dorm. And so Wade began moving his way left along this machine, kind of believing it was going to come to a stop at some point, and then he could walk around it. But it would turn out this machine was very big, very wide. And so by the time he actually got to the left edge of this machine, he was practically right up against the wall of the room he was in. And when he got there, he realized the space between the side of the machine and the wall of the room was big enough that if he turned sideways, he could basically squeeze his way past it. Now, he had no idea how far into the room this strange machine went, but in his drunken state, he decided it was a good idea. And so he turns sideways, so his back is to the wall of the room, and his chest is going to be facing the machine, and he begins pushing himself into that narrow space. And so as he's making his way, his hands are up, kind of protecting his face and neck, and at some point, he kind of begins to trip. Now, he didn't actually fall because he's basically wedged into this tight space, but for a second, he reflexively grabbed with his hands onto this machine right in front of him, and just by chance, his left ring finger slipped into a very narrow hole that was about 2 inches deep. The room that Wade was inside of was called an electrical vault, and it contained 6 large transformers, one of which Wade's finger had just stuck inside of. The job of these 6 transformers is to take the high voltage they receive from the main power grid and then transform it, hence the name, into lower usable voltage that gets dispersed into Owen Hall for residents and teachers. Even though the outside of these transformers had mostly been covered with protective materials that mitigated the electrocution risk, there were still several parts of these machines that there was just nothing you could do. They just presented a really high electrocution risk. And one of those sections you needed to be extra careful with was that 2-inch hole that Wade's finger slipped inside of. At the back of that hole was an exposed electrical conductor, and the second the tip of his finger touched that conductor, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity were pumped into his body. For reference, when people get executed via the electric chair, they are electrocuted with 2,000 volts of electricity. Wade likely died instantly. But because of the fact that he was kind of wedged between the transformer and the wall, after he died, he didn't just slump onto the ground. Instead, he remained in a semi-upright position with his finger still stuck inside of that hole. And so for the next 2 months, his body just continued to be electrocuted every second. Finally, sometime in March, as a result of Wade's body fluids draining out of him, the electrical current that was being pumped into him altered its course, and began snapping outside of his skin into the ground. And so the sound of the electrical current actually striking the ground was that popping sound that the maintenance worker heard. The door that the maintenance worker opened in order to investigate the sound was the only other door that led into the electrical vault, the other being the exterior door that Wade had gone in on. Initially, when the worker opened that door and looked inside of the vault, he actually didn't see Wade, but he smelled something funny, and that was what led him to walk into the room and make his way around, and that's when he spotted Wade's body. Earlier, on January 20th, when they found Wade's shoe, which at some point had just slipped out of the door jamb, so it was not propping open the exterior door when it was found, it was just sitting in that pit area, and the exterior door was shut. And so when they found that shoe, the police, they did go inside of the electrical vault, but they didn't go in through the exterior door. They went around and went in the same door that the maintenance worker opened from right across the hall from the laundry room. And when they opened it up, they just looked into the room. They didn't walk into the room, they just looked from the doorway, and from their perspective, they couldn't see Wade. And so that was why initially they had said, Wade is not inside of that room. Ultimately, because that exterior door to the electrical vault was supposed to be locked at all times, and clearly it was not because that's how Wade got in, Purdue was found to be negligent, and so they agreed to pay Wade's family $500,000, and they also set up a scholarship in Wade's name. During the California Gold Rush of 1848, hundreds of thousands of Americans living on the east coast of the United States packed up their things in covered wagons and headed west for California to attempt to, quite literally, strike gold. About a year after the rush started, so in the winter of 1849, a group of about 100 would-be gold prospectors were on their way across the continental United States to California when they got lost in this totally barren stretch of desert, roughly 500 miles from their destination, which was San Francisco. They would spend the next 2 months driving around this desert looking for a way out, but they wouldn't find it, and so finally they just stopped, set up camp, and waited to die. But as a last-ditch effort, they sent ahead 2 of their fittest men to try to go out and find help. And miraculously, those 2 men would find help, and it wasn't long before the lost pioneers were going up and over this mountain pass out of the desert out to safety. And so as the pioneers are cresting this mountain, one of the pioneers turns and looks down at the desert valley below where they almost all died. And he famously said, "Goodbye, Death Valley," and the name stuck. While Death Valley has since become a very popular tourist destination for adventurous people, it is still truly one of the harshest environments on the planet. In addition to just being a big open desert, which presents a whole host of problems to any mammal, Death Valley also becomes one of the hottest places on the planet every summer. The temperatures soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit and sometimes get as high as 136 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the kind of place where if you don't respect it, it will kill you. In 2005, a 35-year-old man named Robert Darmer, who lived in Los Angeles, California, decided he wanted to take a trip into Death Valley. Specifically, he wanted to go to the hot springs located in the northwest corner of Death Valley, and actually there's a nudist resort that is right around those hot springs, and so Robert wanted to go check that whole scene out. And so on July 26th of that year, Robert left Los Angeles in his Volkswagen van, and he drove north about 4 hours until he got to Bishop, California, which is a small town where some of his family lived. After spending the night with them, the next morning when Robert got up, he got back into his van and he drove south about 20 minutes to a town called Zurich, California, where he picked up Death Valley Road. This road covers the entirety of Death Valley, starting from its northern entrance, where Robert was, all the way south 140 miles to its southern entrance. And this road is actually basically a straight line. But off of this very straight road are literally hundreds of miles of unpaved roads that splinter off in all directions across the desert. And these roads bring people to other points of interest, like, for example, the nudist resort that Robert wanted to go to. So after Robert hopped onto the Death Valley Road at its northern entrance, he began driving south for about an hour, and then he began looking for the turnoff to the unpaved road that would take him the last 50 miles to the nudist resort. And so eventually, Robert believes he's found this turnoff, and so he gets onto this unpaved road and he starts driving for a while, and then all of a sudden his car just sinks down into the ground and it won't budge. It would turn out Robert had made a mistake. He had not turned onto the correct unpaved road. Instead, he had picked a road that led right out onto this salt flat, and so to the naked eye it would have looked like the ground in front of him was totally flat and hard packed, and you could easily walk on or drive on it. But in reality, the surface of the salt flat is very brittle, and underneath that brittle surface is this thick section of mud. And so before Robert could realize his mistake, he had broken through the surface layer of the salt flat and got stuck in that mud. After trying unsuccessfully to get his van back out again, Robert realized he was in a really bad situation. His cell phone had no reception, so he couldn't contact anyone, and he was too far away to attempt to walk to the nearest civilization to try to get help. But luckily, he had packed lots and lots of water that was in his van, and so he decided the only thing he could do was just sit tight at his van, ration out his water, and wait for someone on Death Valley Road to look out and see him and come to his rescue. But after waiting for 6 days, no one saw him. And now his water supply was dwindling, and so Robert decided his only option was to abandon his van and make the walk to civilization. And so he packed up all the water he could, he threw it on his back, and he began to walk. And just like the lost pioneers of 1849, at the very last second, Robert was rescued. As he stumbled across the desert, his canteen empty, this group of teenage boys and a few adults who were part of this group called the League of Venturers were out in Death Valley doing search and rescue training. And so they literally turned onto the same road that Robert accidentally turned onto and then got stuck on. And so they came down and found Robert. And Robert, when he saw them, he was hysterical. He was crying tears of joy. He really believed he was going to die probably that day. And so the League of Venturers, they take Robert into their van and they drive him 80 miles to the nearest ranger station. And as soon as Robert got out of the car, he dropped to his knees and he kissed the ground in appreciation. I mean, this guy really was that close to death. That evening, Robert would hitch a ride from the ranger station back to Bishop, California, and the next morning, Robert spoke with a local towing company, and they agreed to drive him out into Death Valley to locate his van and tow it back out again. But when they got out there and they found his van, the towing company saw that the van was not in good shape. It had 2 flat tires, and there were several other mechanical issues with it. And they told Robert, look, we can't tow it out until the repairs are made, and we can't make those repairs right now. And so they left the van where it was, and they drove Robert back to Bishop. And then when they got there, Robert, who was quite handy with his van, decided he would just make the repairs himself. And so he went around town, he gathered up all the supplies he would need, and then that evening, he got a local young couple to give him a ride back into Death Valley. Robert had told his family right before he left that his plan was to go and fix his van, and then that night come back to Bishop, and then the next day he would contact the towing company again, and they could come out and they could get his van out. But that night, Robert did not come back to Bishop, and the next morning, when his family still had not heard from him or seen him, they contacted authorities. It would take a few days, but the authorities would eventually figure out what happened to Robert. The young couple that gave Robert a ride back into Death Valley, they dropped him off at this intersection right off of Death Valley Road, where they and Robert believed was only about a mile away from that nudist resort that Robert had originally wanted to go to. Robert had told the couple that his plan was just to walk from that point. He would go to that resort and he would recruit somebody else to drive him the rest of the way to the van. He could make the repairs and that person would drive him back, and that would be it. So Robert got out, he said thank you to the couple, and he waved to them as they drove off, and then he stashed his van supplies and then turned away from Death Valley Road and began walking along this unpaved road into the desert. However, unbeknownst to Robert or to the couple, the spot he was dropped off was the wrong spot. He was not a mile or less away from this resort. He was about 15 miles away from this resort, and the path was fairly circuitous, so even if he knew the distance, he likely would not have been able to even navigate his way there. And so after wandering down this unpaved road for about 10 miles, Robert left the unpaved road and began heading out into open desert, likely seeking water. Robert would eventually collapse and die just 4 days after he he had been rescued from the exact same situation. When his body was found, he didn't have a GPS or a map or even a container for water. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it, there's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side, and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about the spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car, and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number, and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason? His family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location. And then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out. He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful, and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th. Which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case, and as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or 2, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him because remember, during that time frame, He didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost. But either way, instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants. So that's going to do it. In 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable, miserable right now. In the future, I will have a family of my own, and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive, and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved into John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically, he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen, and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long, they were both getting physical with each other. And during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie, and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside, and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello, and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place, and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside, and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him, and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned, and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird. And so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's two officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John, it's silent, everything is off, everything is quiet, and they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch, and as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer is kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm, and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror, because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed, he falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her. That the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full-time, was a meat processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives, and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively, John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house and she grabbed his legs and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front of that closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty, however, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is still alive today. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray.
on to small moments, like they could make you stay. But loving you felt borrowed, like sunlight in the shade. You smiled when I got closer, then stepped just out of reach. I kept pretending distance was something I could beat. We were almost stars, yeah, we got so close. Hands in the dark, but never home.
Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out weekly brand new content that you can only get on the podcast. It's called the MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, and it's available on Spotify, iTunes, Apple, Amazon, basically anywhere you get a podcast, that's where you'll find it. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me and then message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is MrBallen, and I really do read the bulk of my direct messages. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post